So we are starting the fourth session of the meetings of Thema, and our guest is Professor Christian Utz from Austria, and Christina Gerling will make the presentation of our guests. Please, Christina, you have our introduction.
Good morning, everyone. It's my great joy to be here. And it's even greater joy to present to you Dr. Christian Utz, Professor of Music Theory and Music Analysis at the University of Music and Dramatic Arts in Graz, Austria, and Associate Professor for Musicology at the University of Vienna. He has also taught musicology and composition at the Universities of Graz, Klagenfurt, as well as the National Chiao-Tung University, Hsinchu, Taiwan, and the University of Tokyo, Japan. Utz studied composition, music theory, musicology, and piano in Vienna and Karlsruhe. In 2000, he received a PhD degree at the Institute of Musicology of the Vienna University with a thesis on new music and interculturality from John Cage to Tan Dun. This was published in 2002. He has been co-editor of Lexikon der systematischen Musikwissenschaft, published by Laber Verlag in 2010, Lexikon Neuer Musik, Metzler Verlag 2016, and as well as the book series Musiktheorien der Gegenwart in 6 volumes for Pfau Verlag 2007-2013. Currently, he's on the board of editors of the Zeitschrift der Gesellschaft für Musiktheorie, so he has edited us to our great joy. Yeah. Utz has been director of the research project, a context-sensitive theory of post-tonal sound organization, and this was done in 2012-2014, supported by the Austrian Science Fund, and is currently directing the research project Performing Experience and Theorizing Augmented Listening, PETAL. His main fields of research include musical performance studies, history and theory of music perception, aesthetics and analysis of vocal music, and intercultural music history and analysis. As a composer, Utz received major artistic impulses from Erich Urbana, Dieter Kaufmann, Wolfgang Rihm, Mauricio Kagel, Luca Francesconi, Brian Ferneyhough, Salvatore Charino, and Helmut Lachenmann. He has been invited to the most important European seminars of new music, such as Royaumont, Etaican, and other such composition seminars throughout Europe, Brussels, Belgium, and so on. And he has received numerous grants and awards. Already in early phases of his artistic development, Utz tried to free compositional concepts from conventional boundaries by exploring concepts spanning the fields of music and theater, composition and improvisation, instrumental and electronic music. Since 1998, intercultural collaborations and concepts have become the center of Utz's compositional activities that are documented in his CD's site. This is a CD from 2002, later transformed in 2008. In 1998, he founded Asian Culture Link to enhance intercultural exchange between European and Asian artists. His present communication, entitled Time, Space, Experience in Works for Solo Cello by Lachenmann, Xenakis, and Ferneyhough, a performance-sensitive approach to morphosyntactic musical analysis, is derived from the aforementioned project, a context-sensitive theory of post-tonal sound organization, aimed at probing the potential of morphosyntactic performative analysis for performance processes of music from 3 different epochs: Baroque, Romantic, post-tonal, envisaging a mutual sensitivity of perceptual and performative processes in the output of both analysts and performers. So you are very welcome to look for his site on the internet, and maybe Rodolfo can show the site so we can all enjoy his marvelous accomplishments so far for such a young and brilliant theorist that we are so happy to have with us today. So I wish everyone a great conference. So please, Dr. Woods, welcome.
Thank you so much. That was by far too long, but it's a really great pleasure to be here, and I hope you can understand me now.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you. So I know this is a difficult time for everybody, and especially for many of you. I think in Brazil, the situation with the pandemic is still very troubling. And, but at least, well, there is some interesting side effect that we might have not get in touch this year without this situation. So I hope we can make something out of it and continue our exchange. I really enjoyed working with you on the major article for the ZGMTH, which I think was the very first time that many of our colleagues here in the German-speaking world heard of your fantastic and long activities in Brazil concerning music theory and analysis. Yeah, so my paper today, as you know, it is already published. So I decided actually to focus on only one example, the Lachenmann-Pression, which is also the most elaborated example in the article. I hope this is fine. So I think we could reserve some of the other 2 examples, Xenakis and Ferneyhough, for the discussion, maybe, if it's interesting. And rather, I would like to show you some background of the research. Christina already mentioned the morphosyntactic analysis and the 2 research projects. Actually, this publication, which was first presented in 2014, it forms a kind of hinge or a connection between these 2 research projects that were mentioned. So CTPSO and PATL like to prefer the abbreviations because the titles are so complicated. So in the first project, we were actually aiming at a perception-sensitive approach to post-tonal music analysis. Of course, we have often heard this argument that post-tonal music is not really adequate to grasp post-tonal music only through a pitch or pitch class analysis, especially if more complex forms of sound transformation, electronics, etc. are involved. So this was the starting point of this project. And in PATL, then it became increasingly clear that the performer, of course, has a crucial impact on how we actually perceive music. I mean, this is a very obvious fact, but it has rarely been acknowledged by music theorists. So that is actually what we try to pursue in PATL, inspired by the more recent tendencies in performance studies, such as Nicholas Cook, who have claimed that musical structures are always constituted in performance. So this is something explored in the Petal project. Also in the Petal project, we did not restrict ourselves to post-tonal music, but rather expanded the repertoire to 19th and 20th century piano and lead repertoire, especially looking at complex and long cycles and the aspect of macrophone. So the starting point in this paper, which is, as I said, I was moving from this analytical to the performance-related perspective. So this article, in a way, combines these two perspectives. And one important observation at that point, so 6 years ago, it might not be, maybe wouldn't formulate it in the same manner today, but at that point, I found it a bit troubling that performance studies in musicology and music theory were so divergent. I mean, there is this kind of what is also called performance science. So the colleagues from empirical musicology or music psychology who often work exclusively on the basis of quantitative data, and then there is the hermeneutic tradition. There are the music historians who are more interested in how historically musical structures were communicated and shaped by certain performances or performance styles. So these two tendencies, they seem to be incompatible, and I tried in a way in this paper for the first time to bridge these traditions somewhat, or to at least find some cross relations between them. And this eventually became the main background of the Petal project, which just ended, by the way, 1 month ago. So it's no longer running, but we're still working on the material, of course. So in this paper, then consequently, there was a twofold approach. So first of all, there was this aspect of morphosyntactical analysis. I will explain this in a minute a bit in further detail. And actually, you will hopefully see it when I speak about the Pression by Lachenmann, that it tries to combine the morphological aspect, so the aspect of shape, and the aspect of time, the temporal aspect. So the syntactical aspect, which has in music has always to do with the passing of time. And the second approach, of course, was to ask myself, well, how would these aspects of space or shape and time be communicated in performance? And the focus I placed on here was time experience. So how is time experienced during listening is a very philosophical question, of course, and many philosophers and composers and music theorists have written about it. In this paper, I tried a rather more pragmatic approach. And the case studies were these 3 cello solo pieces by Lachenmann, Xenakis, and Fernihau. So they are quite well known. It was more or less coincidental. I mean, why did I choose that repertoire? I would say I was listening to Pression, to different recordings of Pression, and it was so obvious that these recordings were so different. They were differing from one another greatly, so that in consequence, I decided to place the focus on this repertoire. So let's have a look at Pression first, and then I'll try to speak somewhat about the analytical framework. So maybe some of you are familiar with this piece. It's a very well-known piece from contemporary music of the 1960s and 70s. And the background is the musique concrète instrumentale. This is a concept devised by Helmut Lachenmann during that period, and Pression is actually one of the key pieces that exemplifies this approach. It is, first of all, it aims at a liberated perception. It aims to provoke our listening conventions, our habits. And one means the composer uses is the complete redesign of notation. Of course, we know that this was very common during the 1960s. But the interesting thing is here that you can already feel in a way from this notation that it's a very tactile, a very, how to say, bodily approach to composition, as the score shows mostly the movements of the hands of the player and not so much the sound result. In 2012, the composer published a revised version of the score. The content is more or less the same, but you see there are more conventional elements such as time signatures and even instructions like espressivo, which are entirely absent from the earlier version. Well, so this focus on the performer and her body also should make it possible for the listener, for the audience, to hear sounds as traces of bodily movements or imprints of bodily movement. And one idea that the composer suggests is that you remove the music stand so that the audience can actually see the cellist and everything that happens. In fact, it's you don't see that often in live performances, as it's not so easy to memorize the piece, and most performers actually play from the score during the concert. Yes, and of course we have to mention that there's also some political dimension in this idea of liberation of perception. It was Lachenmann and other German composers during that period that devised this concept of critical composing. Critical composing was meant to be political in that sense that it provokes the comfortable, habitual listening mode in a traditional concert situation, for example. And so my focus on perceived time was quite pragmatic, as I said, in a way that I derived the framework for this analysis from three archetypes of musical temporality. And of course, these archetypes will be very familiar for you as music theorists. You will have come across these concepts very often in your work. And so it is, of course, a kind of artificial framework to separate these archetypes. Of course, only in the end to say that they're always somewhat interrelated. But we know, of course, that they have been very influential in the history of music theory and music perception. So the architectural model, of course, is the basis of Formenlehre, what we call a theory of form. It could be connected to the discourse on the hierarchy of the senses around 1800 in German and French philosophy and aesthetics, where the superiority of the eye was claimed against the inferiority of the ear. And of course, you know that we are very much used to spatialized metaphors in formal theory. And in fact, we could say that the very term form is also an architectural metaphor. When we transfer this model to perception, we could say that it's very much memory-based, a kind of memory-based perception, which is the basis of architectural time experience. In order to build a kind of architectural image in my mind during listening, I have to very clearly remember what happened 3 or 5 minutes ago in order to build a kind of hyperstructure in my mind that represents the piece that I'm hearing. Yeah, and quite in contrast to that, the processual model would be oriented towards real-time listening. So listening in the moment, but also relating to what you hear now, to what has been before immediately, and expecting what comes next. So it's a kind of temporal flow that is experienced here. And of course, this is very, very common from the aesthetics of musical organicism. A lot has been written about that, and most recently, I'm sure you're familiar with Janet Schmolfeld's book, In the Process of Becoming. And also we could mention Energetics by Ernst Kurt from the early 20th century. And then finally, a listening mode or time experience mode, which is very much related to musical modernity, is the presence model, with manifestations, among others, in moment form by Stockhausen, or moment time, the term by Jonathan Kramer. It is based on a discontinuity of time. So the idea that a single moment has a singularity which cannot be reduced to its function within a continuum. This is, of course, very much also related to post-structuralist philosophy, and we could also relate it to the aesthetic theory by Adorno, who has claimed that works of art in modernity cannot end affirmatively any longer, because this kind of affirmation of form would support the society or the political situation. And as the modernist art in the theory of Adorno is always critical, so it cannot end affirmatively anymore. So this is why it also, its ability to build continuities are obviously and intentionally limited. So these are the three archetypes, and of course, as I said, it's quite artificial to separate them, but well, for reasons of clarity, I tried to do that in this paper, and started to think, well, how could we conceive Lachenmann's piece in a spatial or architectural manner? Well, it's not so difficult to think of that as a musical architecture. It's a quite short piece, duration somewhere between 6 and 9 minutes. And so this helps to understand it as one entity. And then there are two moments in this piece which are really singled out by their duration and by their specific character. One is the pressed bow, almost complete noise, and the other is distinct pitch, the D flat here, which occurs in a kind of beating interference between two strings, which is more or less the only clear and distinct pitch in the entire piece. So this makes these two moments so particular that they exemplify the dualism between pure noise and pure pitch, while all other elements are somewhere in between. And so if we build an architectonic hierarchy for the formal process, we can say that other events somehow are linked to this, and to the middle section as a long middle section where the saltando, the spring bow, is predominant. So we could relate other parts of this piece to these main salient events. And for example, the impulses which start early on in the beginning, they could be related to either the saltando impulses or also to what happens here, where the pressed bow is somehow prefigured. And the distinct pitch is also prefigured several times during the piece earlier. And in the end, we have a saltando again, so that, well, this would be a very classical analytical approach, right? To, in a way, demonstrate motivic resemblances between the different elements of the work, building a kind of architectural structure over the whole piece. A performance that would render such a model would maybe to have sharply distinguish between the different events so that they really can be memorized very clearly. And also a fast tempo might be helpful, so to help us to grasp this as one entire building, so to say. Well, the processional model, what could we do to provoke the processional model in performance? I think it's, in this case, it would be important to show that everything constantly is transforming. The aspect of transformation, of course, is a very important facet of organicism. And actually, referring here to something that the composer has said, he has said that noise and pitch were not distinct in his mind, but were always emerging from one another. And so this actually happens during the piece all the time. And it is very obvious in one of the recordings, at least, and Michael Bach from 1991. And the most interesting thing here is that the pressed bow section also has a kind of pitched quality. If you listen to it carefully, you will recognize that it's also a pitch area around D flat, which is emerging, which of course nicely connects to the other D flats that are coming up in the piece. So I'm demonstrating this by playing to you 4 short excerpts as a kind of very radically abridged version of the entire piece. Yeah, so of course this is well, maybe too radical reduction of the piece, but in consequence, you could of course conceive of the music as, I said, a steady transformation, as demonstrated here by this shading of the white and black colors, so to think of it as one line running through it rather than as a building, as in the architectural model. So as I said, this slow tempo might be helpful here, and to focus on the areas of transition rather than on the events, the outstanding events themselves. Now, the presentist model is also quite clearly conceivable in this piece. As I said, this pressed bow section is singled out by its particular and very unique quality already. So we could conceive of that as a moment which is not in a way connected to what was before and to what comes afterward. And we could conceive of many other areas in this piece similarly. So that in the end, what I tried to do somewhat, funnily with these symbols here, the whole thing would occur as a sequence of more or less independent moments. I mean, this is maybe not a realistic manner of listening, but it's at least an aesthetic approach that would be debatable. And for a performer, again, I think a high degree of contrast, of course, would necessary to transport this image. And maybe in this case, also some irregular tempo that respects the proper time of the individual events could be necessary. This concept of proper time is employed by Lachenmann himself when he describes the sound types in his famous articles, Sound Types of New Music from 1966, first published in 1970. Let's have a look now at how the performers transport these three different archetypes of time. First of all, what do the performers have in front of them? They have the score, which on the one hand has a very rigid grid of time. You see these small bar lines, which are not actually bars in the early version, but it's just a time grid. With each grid having the duration of a metronome, roughly 66 beats per minute. So this would suggest some architectonic structure of the music, actually. But then we have these two moments, the pressed bow and the discrete pitch, where the grid is given up. And instead, a duration is indicated, so 60 seconds and 10 seconds. And this already, well, as I said, marks the specific character of these two sections. Now for the recordings, I compared 15 different recordings. So these were all recordings available in 2014. Meanwhile, there might be some more. And I distinguished 15 subsections and 4 larger sections following up the several existing analyses of the work just to orient myself. And I also calculated the absolute time in these two score versions that exist. So the more recent score version is a few seconds longer only, but of course you can see that no recording actually comes close to the score time of these two editions, but rather most of the recordings are considerably longer. So let's have a slightly closer look at that. If we look at the section 9, for example, this is a section where slowly pitches are emerging from a noise background. We'll look at that closer in a minute. We can see that there's a very strong deviation between the different performances, right? So some performances are very close to the score time here. And it is interesting also because in this case, it is technically not very demanding, and the notation is very regular and strict. So at first sight, there's no obvious reason for stretching the time here, but we'll find a reason, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is just to show you the strong deviations. And of course, here in section 4, which is the pressed bow section, also we have very strong deviations between 27 and 79 seconds. So what should, according to the score, last at least 60 seconds, which is quite obviously not observed by quite a few recordings. So this diagram is somewhat more complicated. So it indicates the relative deviation of the individual sections in each recording. So for example, when we have a deviation of about 100, then this would mean that the duration of this section has the double length of what is indicated in the score. I hope this is understandable. And the first number you have here is the average. Here we would have an average of 34% deviation, here only 16%, here only 9%. So the lower this first number, the closer the average of sections are to the score. Whereas the second number indicates to what degree the proportion between the sections is kept. So let us imagine a performer who chooses to play the piece in a slower tempo, but he wants to play it very strictly in time, then this second number would be very low. And so if we consider both numbers, we can of course see immediately that Caspar in 2009 has the lowest ones. And indeed this recording is quite interesting. I used it as an example for the architectonic or spatialized model of time, because the contrasts here are very clear cut. As you will see here, this is the beginning of the coda. It has a what Lachenmann calls a whistle accent, quasi pfiff, so it's this kind of sound, and usually this sound is not very clear and almost imperceptible, but in this case, well, you will hear. Of course, it's also the microphone very close to the instrument and so on. But the entire recording is like this, marking the sounds very distinctively and therefore being a quite adequate model for the architectonic form, also considering the really low deviations from the score time. Sometimes this distinctiveness of sounds, however, I am not sure if it's really what the composer wanted. Well, this might not be the most important aspect, but it's also the question here in this subsection 9 that I was talking about before already. And we have, as I said, pitch slowly emerging from noise. Whereas in the Caspar recording, this recording here, we have the pitch very clear from the beginning onwards, as you will hear. Well, the sound is quite soft, so I hope it comes across across the Atlantic to you. So when we compare this to the, a short video to demonstrate what is actually happening here. So the left thumb mutes the bowed string, and removing the mute would result in a pitched sound. So actually, it's a very unstable situation. As you can hear in the Stromberg video, which we saw here, the sounds are already much less stable than in the Caspar recording we heard. And they are even less stable in the Bach recording. Yeah, it's probably difficult for you to hear. I could send you the audio examples later on so that you can actually understand maybe more clearly what I want to say here, that here actually in the beginning you have almost no idea what is happening, and there's only a very, very slight indication of pitch. So this is, and also, of course, this means that Bach, he takes much more time for this section, and in general, he focuses on the transformative, on the transformational sections, which would show a certain affinity with the processual time model. And finally, the presentist model, I chose the Coistra recording from 1992. He, as you can see, he very much focuses on this fourth section, the pressed bow one. And actually his pressed bow section is very radical, a very noisy sound with almost no indication of pitch. And we could, I of course go on and try to find other arguments for associating Coistra with the presentist model. But in the end, of course, I'm saying that, well, the listener, as a listener, we have many different options. The performer might direct us in a certain way, but we can still experience process in Caspar or architecture in Coistra. So I wouldn't say it's completely arbitrary, but there is a very complex and not a linear relationship between what the performers do and what the listener experiences. So a short conclusion, and then I think we have many questions coming up, and as I said, I could maybe exemplify something from the two other pieces as well, if you like. There is not the same rigor, so to say, in my handling of the two other examples, but rather I'm referring to certain details that show different concept of the approaches of the performers in approaching time. Well, the most important thing for me in this paper was to start relating performance and the experience of time by a listener at all. And of course, I wanted to do that in a non-essentialist manner. So not claiming that a certain style of performance automatically generates a certain experience of time. But of course, I was also interested in how this research would relate to the broader context of performance studies as that developed by Nicholas Cook, for example. And of course, Nicholas Cook, as you know, he's very much going into these different traditions of musical performance. So especially what he calls the rhetorical performance and the structuralist performance. So it's a kind of steady tension between these two directions. And of course, in contemporary music, we have a very strong influence of structuralist performance, of playing according to the score, right? This is quite common demand in much of contemporary music. And then it's quite interesting that a composer like Lachenmann has said, I didn't mention this earlier, that he wants his Pression to be performed like the piano pieces of Schubert or Schumann, by which he implies, of course, that the performer should use rubato and, well, musical rhetorics to interpret this piece. So in any way, I think we can say that all the performers, they are very individualized in a way. So this is their considerable touch of self-awareness. But on the other hand, they are, of course, also indebted to certain performance traditions. In this case, I would say, for example, Caspar, he has played for more than 20 years in the Ensemble Moderne. And of course, then this is he would be very much shaped by this kind of literalist ensemble tradition that has developed since the 1980s in contemporary. On the other hand, the three scores that I was dealing with here, they are typical for what has been done by some composers in the 1960s, but especially by Lachenmann, to provoke the performers in a way that they have to give up everything they have learned, more or less. So they have to give up all unreflected performance practices and reinvent the instrument and themselves in a way. Because all that they have learned does not help them in approaching these scores. This is maybe particularly evident in the Xenakis, which has some parts in the beginning that are absolutely not playable in time. So the performers have to find their own solutions for that. And of course, the score of Lachenmann in itself calls for a kind of reconsideration of performance practice. And so this kind of impetus of liberation with a political background, I think it could be an inspiration for us today to create this, what I have also called performative analysis, following Lawrence Kramer and Nicholas Cook, which means that we have always multiple possibilities in decoding auditory information in our minds. But also, I think that this kind of analysis could be an inspiration for performers, which we were hoping in the to achieve in the Paddle project. Of course, this kind of prescriptive analysis has a very bad reputation in music theory, meanwhile, so we are very careful that our analysis would be not too authoritarian with respect to performers. So performers do not want to be told by music theorists what to do. This is very understandable, but at the same time, I would say that this kind of performative analysis could provide performers with many fresh and new ideas. And so this is something that I hope to start with this project. And well, there were many further projects in the same direction coming up. But yeah, thank you for your attention. And I hope this was somewhat in time, 42 minutes. And I'm looking forward to the question and the discussion.
Well, I thank you very much, Professor Christian Utz. And I think now we can proceed to the questions. And our first question comes from Professor, sorry,
Carol Gobernikov.
Yes, but I need to share the screen.
Oh, okay. But she will ask the question herself, right?
Yeah.
Great.
So
thank you so much for your wonderful explanation. It was really very illuminating. And I enjoyed very much the article and the repertoire, everything included. So I think that my questions might be included in what you have reflected now is here for your presentation. So I'll read whatever I did. And so I think that maybe I'll add a last one. The pieces that you have chosen to analyze were composed between the years of 1966, Xenakis, and 1976, Final. 10 years of extraordinary art music production, including Lachmann, which is in this period. Considering that during the 80s, several avant-garde composers have abandoned experimental writing, Your choice of repertoire has to do with the idea of écriture, the French words. As a composer and as a theoretician of music, your first interest was on time itself, as in how time passes, or in the extremely expressionist outcome of the pieces. In the first part of the article, you mentioned many different conceptions of time in music, including the traditional ones. Did you find the prevailing concept of time on them? To me, it seemed that from the performative point of view, the length of sections was your main concern. And I'll add an extra one. The concept of music as something that is there, you know, as something, as opposed to something that becomes music in the process. So I think that maybe we should discuss this repertoire from the point of view of becoming and not of being, which is a very good contradiction also. So this is the last one that every other one you have answered already, okay?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. Thank you, Carol. Yes, it's not one question, but at least 5. So
many questions, yes. I enjoyed so much. I was working with questions.
So maybe, yeah, well, why not following from the beginning? So the écriture, I'm not sure if the écriture, if you would define the écriture as a kind of self-contained musical writing, right? I mean, we could see that in Ferneyhough, quite obviously, where the score, the complexity of the written score is in a way an artwork in itself, you know? And then there's the very difficult question of how bring this into performance. So referring to what you said in the end, I would say that this kind of score, it is something that is in the beginning, and then as a performer, you have to make it into something that becomes. So this kind of object like nature of the score in the Ferneyhough, which obviously is a very hard challenge for the performer, quite in contrast to the Lachenmann, where also everything is defined very clearly, so there's no aleatorics here, but at the same time, it is a score that is quite intuitive. I mean, when I see a line going up, as a cellist, I have no problem to move my right hand down, right? So it's somehow, it's something that it has an embodied, it's a writing that has an embodied knowledge. When you mentioned expressionist outcome, I was reminded of a quotation in the article by the cellist Bach, Michael Bach, who wrote something about the expressionist quality of Lachenmann's piece, which he thinks is in a way concealed by this kind of classicist framework. So I think I understand this comment as the performer's concept to liberate himself from the strict structural grid of the score. I mean, just a moment ago, I said that the score is very intuitive and embodied, but at the same time, it is also a very structuralist and well-organized thing. And we know that it was composed in a post-serial manner. So it was, it is a post-serial composition. But I think that what we can see in the length of the sections in the Bach recording, that he has quite strong deviations, it points to this aspect that he sees something expressionistic below this very strict outline which can be seen in the score. So yes, my interest is, well, I wouldn't make any affirmative statement on how time passes in one of these pieces, but my interest is more in how performers could provoke different experiences of time. And I think, I mean, it's always the problem in a presentation. You do not have enough time to play a longer part of the recordings. If you would listen to a longer section of two recordings, you might agree with me that this is indeed quite obvious in many of the recordings, that they approach the piece with a completely different concept of time experience in mind.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed very much reading your paper and listening to you today. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
So next question comes from Guilherme.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank
Hello,
you.
Guilherme.
First of all, thank you, Professor Woods, both for your presentation and paper. It was very intriguing to me. I think temporality is one of the most important issues for researching composition and music theory. So my question has to do with embodied perspective for temporality. So I read it. It's you argue in page 3 that musical expectancies, in particular, a key area of time experience, and through music which has recently turned into a rapidly expanding field of research, are for the most part culturally generated or mediated. From this perspective, considering that particularly in long-term memory, spatialization is vital to process of making sense, how do you understand the role of gesture and performativity as expectation and anticipation in perceptual experience of temporality? I mean, the stress, the tension between measured time in seconds, for example, and received time, how we listen to time according to this, its expectancies in gesture and performance. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you. I was already, well, in this case, I was really happy to have the question beforehand, because it might have been not so easy to answer that question right away. I mean, of course, this opposition between, well, the measured time and the experienced time is a very, very strong point in the entire philosophy of the 20th century, starting with Bergson and other philosophers, and especially Husserl, and then moving on to the composers such as Messiaen, Boulez, and others, who all have read the Bergson, especially in the French area, and not sure if it was equally influential in Brazil. I would be interested about that. And well, if I refer to the Husserl concept of time, I think it's very good. It's a very good concept that you can connect to expectancies, because as you know, the Husserl terms are retention and protension, and so it's not the idea that we have the presence is a point, but it's rather a field. So he speaks of time field. And so this time field always includes what has just been heard and what is going to be probably. So the expectancy, right? And so in this field, which could vary in length, I mean, the music psychologists, they define this window of presence with about 3 seconds. But I think for the music theoretical expectancies, it could be broader, right? It could be more complex. And yes, and this is already a kind of spatialization, don't you think so? I mean, how would we imagine what has just happened if not in a somehow spatialized manner? And of course, we are very much indebted to culturally defined forms of spatialization in pitch space in particular, so the high and the low pitches, right? So it's probably very hard for us to imagine a high pitch as something that lies on the floor. Yeah, so and so that's I mean, and then the point of gesture is of course something very important. The gesture has, I think, a gesture also has time. I mean, it could be a very quick gesture, but it could also be a very slow gesture, as in the Lachenmann, which in the beginning, well, if you like me to share the score for a minute, Rodolfo, is this possible?
Yes. Yes, it's possible. I started sharing, you can do it.
Yeah, just to show everybody what I mean, because I'm not sure if everyone has the score in mind. It would be maybe demanding too much. So I showed I think the first 2 systems before, but now here you can see the first page. And of course, from that, you can see that it's actually one gesture. I mean, the gesture is running through at least up to the end of the 4th system, right? So yeah, it's one movement. And considering that, I would say, well, we could define a gesture as something very quick, like here, these impulses, or something very short, like that one. So something that marks time, that cuts across time, so to say, but also as something that expands in time. And although this might not be completely coherent with the use of gesture in the everyday language, because I think in everyday language we usually mean something very short. But yeah, and I think in music the gesture can be artificially prolonged. This reminds me of Lachenmann's cadence sound. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the sound types of Lachenmann, but the most basic sound type is the cadence sound. So it's just, you know, one tone, some tone that begins and ends, and it could have a fade in and a fade out. But then Lachenmann says, well, we could, as a composer, I could compose out these fade in or fade out, and so one cadence sound could last 5 minutes if I want to. So this means we, as a composer, we could augment a gesture until it becomes an entire piece. And this is, of course, something that is very close to how Lachenmann, I think, conceives of music as an outcome of a bodily movement. So, yeah, that's, yeah, thank you. And in this case, I would say that when you have a gesture, it's also very clear of what to expect, right? If you have a kind of gesture going on like that for definitely 2 minutes, you would probably know what comes next, but then suddenly it's interrupted and we have this kind of pression. And of course, this is clear that Lachenmann here also plays with our expectations and deceives us in a way. Yeah. Okay, I hope this was somewhat answer to your question.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Utz. Thank you so much for
Hello.
your paper.
Hello.
I'm a performer, and I appreciate very much you reminding everybody that yes, us performers don't like our performances dictated by musicologists or theorists. On the other hand, I do enjoy and I'm super thankful for studies such as yours, which are artifacts that make up the field of epistemic complexity that surrounds the musical work, and which are to us performers tools for reflecting upon our performance choices. So the question I wish to make takes into consideration that the performer does not act from the limbic system alone, so to speak. So here's the question. Although you wrote on page 29 that to reduce musical experience to fragmentary real-time listening to the bodily experience of performed sound would turn the necessary amendments which the performative turn has made to establish musicological practices into an impoverishment. Wouldn't you consider pertinent to add the performer's embodied perspective to the study of time in the performance of Pression, considering one could argue that temporality is emergent from the interaction between the performer's body and the instrument via prescriptive notation? What would you consider as possible, if any, epistemological contributions as well as methodological challenges and perhaps shortcomings of an embodied approach to the study of time in performance?
Ooh, well, thank you very much. Also, I was quite happy to have this question beforehand. So I would like to start actually by quoting Nicholas Cook. It's actually one sentence after the one you quoted. And Cook says that we should consider musical works as both frameworks for a performance culture and as objects of contemplation or critical reflection. So in later articles, Cook sometimes was more radical and gave up the second part, and in the end only said, well, let's go beyond the score, to quote the title of his book, and to consider scores only scripts for performance. Mm-hmm. So it was, of course, provocative in the respect of considering the strong emphasis that scores and not performances have received in earlier musicology. So when you ask about the shortcomings of embodied approaches to performance, I would say yes. This shortcoming would be exactly if we would consider the score only a script, which is in a way not so important anymore because we have the performance. I mean, we shouldn't stick too much, I think, to the dualism between musical structure and musical performance. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, to have a very challenging score, to work through the score, really literally going through the work in a spatialized manner almost, and then to be to have it embodied, in a way. So this is also something when I was quoting Lachenmann, who said, well, let's play the Pression like you play Schubert or Schumann. Of course, he did not say in which manner one should play Schubert or Schumann. I mean, we could discuss about that, obviously, for a long time. But he was implying, of course, that you shouldn't stick too much to what is written in the score. But this, of course, implies that first you have made the score completely your own in the process of rehearsal, and which is, of course, what every excellent performer would try to do, or would aim for. I hope this is a response to your question, and also, of course, each performer would find different solutions. So that's the most important aspect. So every structure is multivalent. I mean, we could, if we would have a closer look at the Ferneyhough, it's of course much more difficult here, because the Ferneyhough is so much determined, and the degree of determination again, it reaches a degree that cannot be matched by any performance. So, of course, this should not be excuse to simply improvise, which is what some critics have suggested. This wouldn't be in the sense of the composer, but the composer also says, well, I want a certain fidelity to the score, but not exactitude, right? So exactitude is not a criterion, but the fidelity is a more complex criterion, which could result in quite different renderings. Mm-hmm. But then when you compare the Ferneyhough recording, I found only 3, and I was very surprised that they, in the first 2 sections, which I measured, that they were so similar. So they were obviously, all the 3 of them were very much reading the score very, very closely and studying very closely. Of course, it's hard to think of any other way of approaching such a score. So yeah, I hope this somehow
complement what you're talking about, Lachenmann, what he understands about the rhetorical style of performance. I was watching a documentary of him and David Fels performing Pression, and there was one moment in the documentary where Fels goes to make a gesture, and Lachenmann corrects him, and his body movement gives it all. It's another meaning. So that's to illustrate what I was trying to get to into an embodied perspective, not just the analysis of recorded performances, which might be kind of a convenient adaptation of the musicological field to the performative turn, but it's not yet the voice and the perspective of the performer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree with that, of course. I mean, it's only one aspect, but how then would we find criteria when you say, well, Lachenmann explains to Lukas Fels by suggesting a certain body movement, which is quite common, I think, in instrumental teaching, right? So the teacher shows you something and the student, well, imitates it. Yeah. What is the criterion? I mean, is there something that he said to explain it, or was it more intuitive? I think it's very hard to find criteria for discussing this area.
It is. It's a multidisciplinary effort. Totally. We need various disciplines, different disciplines to tap into that kind of knowledge. That's for sure. But in the Lachemann's example, he just did with the body, not with the voice, not with words, just with the body. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he has learned a lot over the decades, which ways of explanation work well with performers and which don't.
Exactly, because we can think, but we act from here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's something we actually try to somewhat consider in the Paddle project, where we were also doing workshops with performers. So we were, doing this kind of measurements of recordings and so on, quite technical. But then we're going to the workshop and confronting the performers with these research, and they often reacted like what you said now, that they defended their intuitive approach, and it was in the end, it was very enriching, I think.
It is, and it was amazing to watch Casper performance. It was a live from the Ensemble Moderne from April this year. Pression, very close to the time of his recording, 2009. Very close. It was like, wow.
Oh, thank you. It was online, or
it is on YouTube, the Ensemble Moderne channel. It's really beautiful performance.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Marcelo. Yeah.
Seu microfone está fechado, Rodolfo.
Sorry, my microphone was off, and I have to start again. Marcelo is not here. He had a family issue, emergency related to health problems in the family. And he was the first one to ask the question. He was excited of being here, but I have to read his question on his behalf. Okay. So the question he asked is, the morphosyntactic approach of our paper seems to bring forward to instrumental and vocal music analysis aspects that have been studied in different approaches by electroacoustic music theorists, composers, such as Schaeffer, Smalley, Roy, and Wishart, but also musicologists such as François Lalande, besides composers with histories rooted both in electroacoustic and instrumental vocal music like Xenakis. Based on the sound time archetypes discussed in your article, is your intention to continue to research proposing a set of categories and/or music descriptors that other analysts might use or upon which composers or performers could work? I remember that he's an expert in technology, so descriptors is something that he's been working for a long time. On the other hand, from the pedagogical point of view, which interests me particularly, do you think that your research might generate a teaching method for helping studies to envisage strategies to perform the music they are studying? So those are the two questions.
Well, yeah, thank you. To refer to the electroacoustic theorists like Schaeffer, Smalley, and so on, of course, I'm a little bit familiar with these systems as well. And maybe if you allow me to share my screen again, I would shortly show you where we started from. Well, around 2009, I think, we started from this kind of morphological categorization. So you have it here. It's in German only, but I think you can easily guess what I mean. So, well, this is a kind of, you know, field of morphological and syntactical category, building the morphosyntactical approach. So sounds considered as shapes and sounds considered as events in time or transformation in time, with a lot of different subcategories and all sorts of, you know, aspects implicating how these sounds might be described. For example, the tuning system, or here sine wave and white noise. So here we have some categories that are also familiar from electroacoustic music. So yeah, this was evidently, it was familiar in the beginning, and also the sound types by Lachenmann were of course very influential to some degree. But what I thought early on would actually be missing in these categories was the aspect of form and the aspect of time. So this is of course always the problem of a shape or gestalt oriented approach, that it tends to focus too much on the spatial imagination of sounds and somehow loses sight of the temporal dimension. So by the morphosyntactical approach, I tried to, you know, enhance the temporal dimension in a way. And for the pedagogical purpose and also the scholarly purpose, I think, yes, it is very important that you start to think about methods of analysis that go beyond the score-based procedures that we are used to, even in tonal music, of course. So I'm quite curious. This seminar we will have this semester we will have a seminar on the so-called secondary parameters. You know that this is a term by Leonard Mayer that was used for all these things that are most important for the morphosyntactical approach. So the instrumentation, the timbre, the dynamics, the tempo, and so on. So, and to apply these criteria also to more classical styles. Yeah, and the last thing, when Marcello, he was asking, might generate the teaching methods for helping students to envisage strategies to perform the music they are studying. So I was just editing or revising an interesting article by a colleague from Germany who tried to do this with his students, actually. So they were analyzing Lachenmann or other noise-influenced music, and the students were then taking their instruments and simply trying to imitate what they heard from the recording without looking at the score. And he called this sound field analysis. So the students would also, you know, make sketches of what they heard only based on their listening experience, and then try to make this more and more precise over several listening sessions. yeah, so I think this could be, such a method could be also applied very well from the morphosyntactic approach. Yeah.
Very good. So now we'll go to the last question of the panel. That is from our friend Cássia Carrascosa, and that will read her question. Are you?
You're a flutist, obviously.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor, for your paper and presentation. I'm very glad to be here. And somehow my question was answered by your presentation, by others' questions as well. In any case, I will read. Given the differences between the performances of the pieces reflected in the variation of durations, in the individuality of the gestures and the creativity used by each performer to solve the challenges proposed by the score, I believe that we can improve our approach, avoiding the reinforcements of territories or actually erasing them to promote a more egalitarian dialogical communication. The understanding that performances have authorship can enlarge the collaboration network between the idea and the performance, and also between the composers and the performer, to thicken the network and amplify the diversity of creative instances. I would like to hear your comments about this proposition. We should rethink the boundaries between artistic territories and solve our ideas of hierarchy in concepts of performance.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not 100% sure what you have in mind when you speak about hierarchy, the concept of performance. Do you mean that the score, do you have in mind the score, or do you have in mind more generally the composer's authority and the performer would only be, you know,
yes, I have in mind this idea about the composition or the composers. You have a great work, you studied like 15 performances, and we have the word by Xenakis, we have what Lahman said, we have what Ferneyhough thinks, but and we have the performances, but we don't have the words by the performers. And even when we are working with composers, I do a lot myself. I think there is a lot this sovereignty of the idea, and when we are performing, we are maybe consider like you understand, like
yeah. Mm-hmm. I think what you say is that the performer have their own independent ideas, and the composer has his or her idea, and this should be on an equal level, right? Mm-hmm.
I think the discussion should be more equal, yes.
Yeah, so to this end, I mean, I'm very critical of this kind of idea that a composer's intention must be rendered in a performance. So that's why in the paper I was trying really to quote the performer's own perspectives, although it was sometimes it was a bit enigmatic, if you understand what I mean, because the performers, when they speak about their own performances, it's very hard to grasp what they actually mean, sometimes at least. And I was quoting Michael Bach before, he says, well, this is an expressionist music that is hidden under a classicist structure. Yeah, we cannot be sure which consequences this actually has for him as a performer. Of course, it's an interesting idea, but well, what does it have? Which consequences does it have? Anyway, I think but that it's great, you know. Of course, in the period of open form, there was a long discussion on whether open form actually leads to an emancipation of performers or not. And Konrad Böhmer, for one, he was very critical of this idea. He said, well, no, this is not at all an emancipation of the performer. It is just, the composer is just too lazy to define all these parameters. Of course, this was also a very ideological discussion, but in a way, I think it's true that the interesting thing is not so much leaving things open in the score, but working, as I have said before, working through the score and then developing your completely independent idea of it. And this is even, I think we can even observe this in hardcore serialist pieces like Boulez's Structure 1A. I made a very close analysis of 3 recordings of this piece, which I found. I didn't find more. The observation was that, well, the performances were quite different in character and in tempo and in the overall conception of large-scale form, in the length of the silences in between and so on. So, yeah, I would completely agree with what you say, of course. I mean, that's, I wouldn't go so far though, but Cook has said, you know, he has this chapter where he writes on the work as performance. So he wants really to define the musical work through performance only. And of course, this is in serving his idea of getting rid of the score as an authoritarian model for interpretation. But I think this is somehow too one-sided again. So I like this quote, the scores as an object of contemplation or critical reflection. And this is something that I think we shouldn't give up. And yeah, so that's basically my, so thank you for the question. Yeah, it's basically completely agree. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, as we finished with the panel, we have one question of a guest, Professor Dimitrios Kataropoulos, that unfortunately has a problem with his mic. So he wrote on the chat his question, and I have to read it. And the question is in 4 parts. And the first part is the presentation. The score was described as demonstrating the gestures and motions of the hands and arms. And how innovative this is. Isn't this always the case in notation? So, the question is about how innovative is the way that Lachenmann writes. The second part of the question, the score examples used were at first aligned to their order in the score. Was this coincidental, or does the order imply Lachenmann's way of composing out his material? And concerning organicism, does it apply to the composing out process or to distinct elements? This is difficult to summarize, but you can read in the chat. You have access to the chat also.
Yes, but I cannot see that question because I think he sent it only to you, probably.
Yes, yes. So I will copy the question and for
yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. Do you have another question? I think. And let's do those first 2 questions, and then we can read the other two.
Yes. So, Dimitrios, where are you? Yeah. So he's my former master student. He just did his master's exam a few days ago. So yeah, and so he is quite how to say well informed about all this research on performance that we have been doing over the past few years. So about the gesture and notation, if this is not the case in every score, well, of course, to some degree. And of course, Dimitrios himself, he has just worked on the Liszt piano adaptation or transcription of Schubert's Winterreise. And when we see this, you know, you have this Liszt scores in mind with all these virtuosic scales and figures going up and down. Of course, this has a very gestural quality as well, clearly. But the meaning of the score of Lachenmann, I think, is to, in a way, make the performer discard all this experience with conventional scores and to start from scratch. I mean, that's, of course, a very, yeah, I think we have often discussed whether the idea in the 1950s, the serial music and so on, it was, you know, tabula rasa, defining music from the roots once again, or without any roots. Of course, this is very controversial idea, and well, like Richard Taruskin and many other musicologists, they have strongly challenged this point. And so in the same sense, we can say that, well, of course, the way that the score of Lachenmann is designed, it very much relies on what is familiar from traditional scores. But in the same time, it foregrounds an aspect that in the traditional scores is only implicit, I would say. So in a way, it reverses the conventional hierarchy of a pitch-based score. And I'm not so sure about the second question you were asking. It's about the order of the sections in the finished score, whether these are actually demonstrate a certain order of the material. But I think the compositional process of this piece has not been analyzed by anybody, including myself. So I didn't look at the sketches yet. And so all I know is that Lachenmann did not use his complex system of structural net, which he used in many other pieces of this period. So you mean the first page with the examples? Yeah, the score examples. Yeah. So yes, I mean, of course, this is if we're speaking about temporality, we can say we speak about beginning and ending, right? This is a very common point in discussion of form. You know, maybe you're familiar with the beginning, middle, end paradigm defined by Kofi Agawu, and also taken up by William Kaplan. So this is the idea that in classical form, each event is specifically defined by being either beginning, middle, or end of something, of a phrase or of the entire movement. And in post-tonal music, most commonly these kind of temporal functions are omitted or given up. So when you listen in the middle of a post-tonal piece for 10 seconds, would you recognize whether it's a beginning or end or middle? It's not easy to say in most cases, but the beginning of Pression is a typical beginning because it starts dal niente, which is something that Lachenmann also, you know, it's the title of another piece of him for clarinet. And also it's the idea of cadence sound, which I explained earlier. So you have something coming from nowhere and only slowly becoming audible at all. So that is why the time duration of the piece is difficult to measure, because it's very hard to say when this piece actually begins. And the ending is a bit more clear because we have this saltando accent, but then also there's something after that. So yeah, then it has we could also say it's an open beginning. You know, it mixes with the outside noise in the manner of Cage 433. And you probably in a concert, you see the cellist moving, but you do not hear anything. So this would create the effect that you have the gesture only without sound. And yeah, that's quite interesting. But I'm not so sure if it's about composing out. So if it's how this relates to the structural background of the composition, we can only guess that it is based on a serial ordering of performance techniques. So he obviously derived the piece from a serial organization of performance techniques, but in which manner it has not been researched yet. Yeah, so I hope this was somehow.
Okay, yeah, and he has two more questions. If I saw correctly, Stromberg's recordings seem to correspond to the scores more than Kasper's in terms of overall duration. What did make Kasper's performance more suitable than Stromberg's?
I wouldn't say suitable, but so the Casper has some, it has a lower deviation between the sections. So whereas the Stromberg, you know, he was very close to the score in some sections, but in other sections he was deviating quite strongly. Also, you know, it's possible that you, in the end, you match the total duration, but in one section, you play 10 seconds longer, and in the next section, 10 seconds slower. And then in the end, you end up with the correct total duration, but in fact, it's not really the proportion that is in the score. So that is why the Casper is the most, the closest to the score in that respect. But that was not the only aspect. It was also this experience when close listening that these sections are so clearly marked. So it's really a very transparent and almost didactic rendering of the different sound qualities.
And he has another question that I will ask permission to adapt the question for another question that I would have, because he asked if Lachenmann made any judgment for any performance, choosing some, this is good, this is bad. And I would ask, do you think that the composer has the authority to judge the performances? Because sometimes they are very bad judges, you know, or very bad performers of their own music. If you listen to Bartók performing his music, is awful.
Or Stravinsky, maybe, or Schönberg conducting Pierrot Lunaire. It's really terrible recording, but it was, of course, I mean, it was the earlier period, and of course the level of the musicians was generally, you know, it was not so high as what we're used today. I'm not speaking about Bartók's pianism, but mostly about the orchestras and the conductors. So, well, No, I wouldn't put too much weight on how Lachenmann judges the performances. I have not heard any distinct judgments from him, and I think he would refrain from making too strong judgments in either direction. Although, of course, he is very critical when he is in the rehearsal. So, and as I said earlier, I think he has learned a lot. I mean, I'm sure you know that he has had very hard experiences over the 1970s and 80s, where his music was entirely rejected by the orchestras, and it must have been really very, very hard for him to stand up against that and to stick to what he has written and to defend it. And I think that's how he developed this kind of very sensitive approach of explaining what he wants and why. Today, you know, it's no problem anymore, at least in Europe. I'm not sure the experience he has made in other countries or other continents, but I think generally now he's a very well-established composer anyway, so this problem is not so pressing anymore. But I think from that perspective, well, I would like, one of the recordings I think was on the YouTube. You find it was a result from a workshop at one of the, I think the Vienna Music University. Yeah, unfortunately I haven't been present at rehearsal. So this is something that we more in the Petal project we try to consider more. Also the rehearsal process. And Anna, who is also here today, I think she's going to do that for the serialist music, to consider also rehearsal processes and how actually a certain performance comes about. And this of course, there are some studies on that, but it's there are not many studies because it's a very complex, issue, and yeah. Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is a really good response. I mean, earlier Lachenmann, of course, he could be very radical in his in the way he judges about certain issues and the way he responds to what some musicians or composer colleagues or listeners might have said. But well, yeah. The interesting thing is that all three performers that I quoted in the paper, all three of them, they were referring to Beethoven or to classical structures. And I said, well, the Pression is not different at all from a Beethoven sonata. Yeah, I'm not so sure if this is really true, but of course, this is something that the composer also likes to argue, you know. When you have to, I just wrote an article for an encyclopedia on this sound type article by Lachenmann, and it compared the different versions. So in the very earliest version, there was no Chopin and there was no Beethoven examples in this article. It came only in the later versions. So obviously, this was something that Lachenmann later on only discovered, that he had to, like Schoenberg, of course, you know, he had to somehow connect to the big art music tradition in order to lend some authority to his music. And this is of course something that yeah, has to do with the historical situation and so on. Yeah. Yeah.
With one comment about Lachenmann. In '78, he came to Brazil to a summer course. And yes. He thought, do you know that he taught here in '78? And I was there, I was his student. and but all he thought about was about Webern, you know, the constellation of sounds in Webern, the idea of serialistic music as with an approach of non-ordered, because it would result in something that has three dimensions in not one dimension. That's the idea of serial. No, that one. That's what I remember of the course, many years ago, not more than 30 years ago.
Was it organized by Gabriela
Paradecais? Yes.
Paradecais, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
All of the organizers of that course are dead already. Conrado Silva, Gabriela, and her husband.
Yes.
Unfortunately, none of them, but some students are here yet to testify for what happened at that course.
Yeah, I know that he was there in the 70s, and there was this. What was the name of the courses? I think it was a regular.
Yes, yeah, Latin American courses of contemporary music.
Yes, yes.
Each year it happened in a different country.
In a different country.
It traveled all over South and Central America, and it was a very important.
Is there something similar today? Or?
No, it doesn't have anything. It stopped a long time ago, and nothing replaced that idea. And also the idea of integration of Latin America that was very prevailing in that time, an ideal that we had in mind, never really happened, and faded away as an ideal, as I think, unfortunately.
Should start again.
I hope so. That was one of my main, you know. Okay. So we have we have time for one more question. If somebody else has one thing else to ask, Catarina, you are signaling there, so it's yours.
Okay, I have one curiosity. In your paper, you cited Mosh observations of the high degree of consistency in the sounds produced in the recordings. And have you thought about that? How to explain that?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I agree. After, of course, it's, you know, the closer you listen to music, the more you realize the differences. And I think, yeah, what I started with actually, and so this will be the last sharing of the screen, but I wanted to show you something which I did earlier in 2012 actually. So here I started with, you can see here this, I had that already, and I compared the duration of the pressed bow section and the emerging pitch. So yeah, so here in the Koistra, you see it's quite unclear. Also the Grimmer, who uses gut strings actually, which makes the sound very noisy also. And here I have this spectral analysis of the Bach, where you can see quite strongly this fundamental, the D flat or C sharp coming out. And yeah, so as considering that, I mean, what's the consequence of this? It's actually the pressed bow sounds different in each recording, quite different. And then I was working with the cellist who explained to me, well, yeah, it's true. It's almost impossible to suppress the pitch quality, but it also depends on your instrument. It depends on the strings, it depends on the bow. So it is something very, you know, unstable that you cannot control to 100%. So now going back to the idea that the score is more or less strict. I mean, it's hard to compare it to piano score by Beethoven sonata because of course, the Beethoven sonata will also very much depend on the instrument, whether you use a forte piano or you use a Steinway or rather a Bösendorfer. But then I'm not sure if these differences would be as profound as the difference between the different pressed bow sections. And then there's the question of timing, of course. I mean, there's this, the composer, you know, in this discussion that I was quoting, Lachenmann has said the performance should recognize the proper time of the sound. So this is this idea that each sound requires its own proper time. But then, well, why didn't he adjust the score accordingly? I mean, why did he devise this very rigorous grid of time and not, you know, simply compose out the time that the sounds require? This is, of course, a very strong tension. And so that's what I say. The closer you get into a piece, the more the differences occur to be obvious. Was talking about the Structure 1A by Boulez. So when you hear the 3 recordings for the first time, you would say, well, it's the same piece. The recordings are quite similar. Well, maybe here it's 2 seconds longer, here's 2 seconds shorter, but the difference is not so obvious. But when you deal with it, and as a performer, you deal with it for a very long time. And I think, so then I would be very interested to learn more about how performers experience time during performing. It is very, very different from the listener, of course, because they cannot be so relaxed. And yeah, so what would you say about that?
Let me go back a little bit to my question. I really thank you from the bottom of my heart showing me the discrepancies in pitch and helping me have another understand of Moshe's perception of high degree of the same sound. So it's not quite the same sound, but not knowing this, what I thought was, what if Italo Gomez, the cellist who premiered Pression, and the subsequent performances and recordings kind of helped to establish a performance practice that could work in a way as an oral score for performers, right? It was like, oh, I would be so much interested in knowing more about the performance history of the piece. Like in the same way when we have descriptive notation that we go from the final sound to building the gestures to get to the final sound. And time then, the time discrepancies among the recordings, not the sounds themselves as pitches, no? Become very discrepant. Like Pogorelic, Rachmaninoff, Moment Musical number 4 in B minor is like double the time of everybody else. So is it the same piece? It's not the same piece. So my thinking went on that direction of perhaps the existence of a oral.
Yeah, that's really a great point, I think, because in contemporary music we definitely have this kind of oral traditions. I was just concluding a long paper on Kurtag, Kurtag's Kafka fragments, And so there has been some considerable research on the performance of Kurtak's music. And you know that Kurtak, he was a teacher of chamber music in the Budapest Academy. And so he was very, very hard insisting on one particular version of a performance. So he was not at all as liberal as we are today in granting this plurality of performances. No, he was saying, well, this has to be like that. But then how did he try to achieve this in his course? He has, you know, this kind of notation which is very ambiguous. He uses different symbols. He black and white note heads and different forms of fermatas. But actually, I mean, sometimes in the score, he would give a kind of legend for explaining these different symbols. But in the end, it does not help. It's just material to work on in the rehearsal. But what happens when you don't have the composer available for the rehearsal? And then this happens, what you said, it's an oral tradition. So you would probably listen to recordings or to ask someone who is experienced in this piece for help, because the score alone, it's impossible. If you don't have a recording, it's impossible to really say what it means. It's quite open. And so this, of course, we have the same thing for John Cage. We have a very strong tradition of oral Cage performers. And there are probably some Cage or Kurtak performers who would say, well, this piece goes like that and in no other way, right? So it's a very clear idea of how the performance should go, which is quite in contrast to what the composers, at least in the case of Cage, has said about his own music. So I think this is a really very interesting field. It's not at all researched sufficiently.
I have a testimony here about that.
Please.
We performed with Beatriz Roman, that was a PhD student on Cage's music, his concerto for piano from the 60s here in São Paulo. And I went with Beatriz to Cage's house, and he borrowed us or lent us the material for the performance. And we spent a whole afternoon talking about how to perform the piece. And my idea beforehand was that he would be very open to, you know, to different.
Was not.
And he wasn't. He was absolutely. He thought that as much strict to the score you follow, the best the performance will be. So it was very surprising to me, this approach. Yep. And I proposed to him that the problem of the conductor was almost impossible to solve. How he conceived the idea of working as a clock and so on, and controlling many things at the same time. So I proposed to him to have a computer program controlling the time for you know, and he asked, that's it, that's what I want, and we did it.
Okay.
And so the performance was controlled by a computer in 86 or 87. And then we sent the recording of the performance, and he said, that was the best performance that I had of my piece.
Fantastic. Do you still have this recording? I would be very interested. Is it published?
The radio station recorded. Radio. So probably I can find it at the radio. But maybe I have a copy at home here in a cassette tape, because at that time everything was on cassette. I have to find out. But I don't think it was a great performance. You know, we had ordinary conditions to do that, not a very special condition. But I think he liked the idea of doing with the computer. Yeah. That's what I think was more, you know,
well, he was working with computer-based trance operations himself, and
yeah, at that time he was working in the Opera, the opera with the computers.
Yes.
Yes. So that's why he was open to the idea.
Yeah, I wrote exactly about that. That you would think that the Cage performance of Cage work is very open, but in fact he was insisting on discipline of the performers and so on. So there's a very interesting tension between the open work concept and a very narrow concept of how the performance should go.
Exactly. Some authors even go as far as saying that Cage, instead of abolishing or going against the work concept that Guy explained so well, he reinforces it or he actualizes it into avant-garde music. So, yeah.
Okay. So, anything else, Carol? Do you want to say something? No. Okay. So.
Yes.
Oh,
I was trying to no, about Cage, because he was strictly interested in measuring time. So measured time was very important. So this is absolutely, you know, and even his performances were very measured. Whenever, you know, with different kettles and water and things like that, but always very measured. And also the bigger performances with lots of improvisation, with radio stations, everything, they were all calculated second by second. Yes.
Stopwatch. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to say a last word. It was a wonderful experience this morning with you. I enjoyed very much. I think everybody did. The subject is the best ever, you know, like you talking about music and performance. Can't be better than that, in my opinion. And it was really wonderful. I thank you so much. It was very nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
it was a pleasure.
So I ask to everybody that has a camera to open the camera now, so we can say goodbye and thank for Professor Christian Utz for his wonderful and
thank you, Professor.
Okay,
it was great. Thank you so much.
So I really want to point you to some of these guys that are present, like Diderik, and I was talking about Anna and Luca. So all of them are working in similar areas with me, either in Graz or in Diderik is working in Leuven. And so I think this is becoming somehow a strong trend, because all of us are interested in, you know, bringing back music theory into this area of sounding music. And I hope this will continue.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you next week.
See you soon. Yeah.
See you soon.
And have a good time. Have a good day.
Okay.